Welcome to the Environmental Justice Rulemaking Training. This session focuses on the regulations that have been developed to implement New Jersey's historic first-in-the-nation environmental justice law. First, let's put the law in the context of the state's holistic approach to environmental justice. The concept of environmental justice is based on the fundamental and inarguable premise that all residents of the state of New Jersey, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, color, or national origin, have a right to live, work, learn, and recreate in a clean and healthy environment. Achieving environmental justice requires fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, rules, and policies. This goal can only be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making processes in the places they live, learn, work, and recreate. These principles date back at least to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where grassroots communities nationwide documented disproportionate environmental burdens endured by low-income communities and communities of color. And New Jersey is certainly no exception. Our low-income communities and communities of color have historically been subject to disproportionately high number of environmental and public health stressors. Beginning with the issuance of Executive Order 23 in April 2018, which directed all state agencies to begin to incorporate the principles of environmental justice into their policies and decision-making procedures, the Murphy administration has worked diligently to better acknowledge and redress these disparities. Consistent with Executive Order 23, on October 1st, 2020, the department issued Furthering the Promise, a guidance document for advancing environmental justice across state government, which provides a path for New Jersey's executive agencies to weave the principles of environmental justice into their core functions, including development of action plans, with an interagency council coordinating efforts to increase environmental and public health benefits for those overburdened communities. Through these actions, taken together with the environmental justice law and its implementing regulations, New Jersey is taking deliberate and meaningful steps to further the promise of environmental justice by working to redress historic inequities, ensure a voice for affected communities, and providing communities with the tools they need to advance towards the triple bottom line: social, environmental, and economic success. In September 2020, Governor Phil Murphy signed New Jersey's environmental justice law, the first of its kind and the nation's most empowering environmental justice legislation. This law comes thanks to the efforts of community leaders and advocates who have dedicated their lives and work to the cause of environmental justice, legislative champions, longtime environmental professionals at the department, and business leaders invested in their host communities. The EJ law is premised, in part, on the recognition that existing environmental standards are often formulated based on the effect that pollution has upon general populations spread over wide geographic areas, which may fail to fully consider localized impacts and erode a community's fundamental right to live, work, learn, and recreate in a clean and healthy environment. Our data shows that New Jersey's low-income communities and communities of color have historically been subject to disproportionately high number of environmental and public health stressors, including mobile sources of pollution and numerous stationary sources of pollution. Further compounding this inequity, New Jersey's overburdened communities often lack important environmental benefits, such as quality green space, sufficient tree canopy, or adequate stormwater management. Now the department begins its work to implement this game-changing law. With the implementing regulations effective in April 2023, we'll build upon the efforts conducted under Administrative Order 2021-25, with the opportunity to fundamentally improve the lives of residents in overburdened communities. The EJ law requires us to consider how certain facilities seeking permits to construct and/or operate in overburdened communities will contribute to environmental or public health stressors in that community in a manner that is disproportionate when compared to its neighbors, a comparative analysis. In conducting this comparative analysis, the department is empowered to consider environmental and public health stressors on a facility-wide basis, including elements not previously subject to certain of the department's media-based regulatory schemes, such as mobile sources of emissions. To that end, the EJ law enhances existing departmental authorities, many of which are focused on reducing adverse impacts to certain environmental media, but may not have historically always been able to fully address facility-wide environmental impacts, the concentration of facilities in given geographic areas, or the cumulative effects of facility siting decisions.
Let's look at the environmental justice law. We will review the New Jersey Legislature's determinations, as well as our stakeholdering and public outreach. We think it's important to ground ourselves with the legislative intent expressed in the law's findings, which you see here on the screen. The legislature found that all New Jersey residents, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, color, or national origin, have a right to live, work, and recreate in a clean and healthy environment. Additionally, the legislature recognized that historically, New Jersey's low-income communities and communities of color have been subject to a disproportionately high number of environmental and public health stressors, including pollution from numerous industrial, commercial, and governmental facilities located in those communities. The legacy of citing sources of pollution in overburdened communities continues to pose a threat to the health, well-being, and economic success of the state's most vulnerable residents, and that it is past time for the state to correct this historical injustice. The legislature found and declared that no community should bear a disproportionate share of the adverse environmental and public health consequences that accompany the state's economic growth, and that the state's overburdened communities must have a meaningful opportunity to participate in any decision to allow facilities which, by the nature of their activity, have the potential to increase environmental and public health stressors. Finally, the legislature found that it is in the public interest for the state, where appropriate, to limit the future placement and expansion of such facilities in overburdened communities. These findings speak to a legacy of inequitable siting of pollution-generating facilities in low-income communities and communities of color, the need to more equally share the burdens of our state's economic development, and the need to correct this historical injustice through meaningful public engagement, and under the appropriate circumstances, placing limits on the construction of new facilities and on the operations of existing facilities. Moving to the rulemaking efforts, to build this rule, we completed rigorous stakeholdering with targeted stakeholder sessions on specific topics you can see on the left, and multiple public hearings in 3 locations as well as virtually, as shown on the right. We owe a debt of gratitude to our stakeholders for helping us shape the final product. For the EJ rule to apply, 3 criteria must be met. The facility must be located in an overburdened community, be one of 8 types of facilities listed by the EJ Act, and seek an individual permit under the program areas listed on screen. First, to be located in an overburdened community, let's define what an overburdened community is. It's a census block group in which at least 35% of the households qualify as low-income households. At least 40% of the residents identify as minority or as members of a state-recognized tribal community, or at least 40% of the households have limited English proficiency. Next, let's look at the facility types. We have major sources of air pollution like power plants and cogeneration facilities, incinerators or resource recovery facilities, large sewage treatment plants, transfer stations or solid waste facilities, recycling facilities that receive at least 100 tons of recyclable material per day, scrap metal facilities, landfills, and medical waste incinerators, except those attended to hospitals and universities. Looking at the permits, there are permits covered by the Act in various program areas, including solid waste and recycling, land use, water supply, and air pollution. While this is a broad subset of permits, it's important to note here that the law applies only to individual permits. The law excludes authorizations or approvals necessary to perform remediation. It also excludes minor modifications to major source air permits that do not increase emissions. This is what the OBCs look like within our state. The law doesn't apply to all development in OBCs. The facility must be one of the 8 types of facilities listed in the law. At its most basic, the law requires us to consider how the facility might affect the environmental or public health stressors in an overburdened community as compared to its neighbors, a comparative analysis. Environmental and public health stressors. First, let's start with a couple of key concepts we should define briefly to aid in the understanding of the remainder of the analysis. First, the stressors. The statute gives us broad categories that we work to fill in with appropriate data points, using data that is publicly available, reliable, and accessible, and usable at the block group level. Also note the inclusion of regulated facilities as stressors, standing for the proposition that when located in abundance, those facilities may, in and of themselves, represent a stressor on the community. Also important to note here the use of may cause with regard to public health stressors. That allowed us to consider present conditions such as age of housing stock, lead service lines, ambient air monitoring, proximity to highways, to inform these categories. Environmental justice impact statement and meaningful public participation. Permit applicants must submit an environmental justice impact statement and hold a public hearing in the overburdened community to present the EJS with additional public participation. The environmental justice impact statement assesses the potential environmental and public health stressors associated with the facility, the environmental or public health stressors already borne by the overburdened community, any adverse environmental or public health stressors that cannot be avoided if the permit is granted, and measures to avoid or minimize facility contributions to stressors in the OBC. The EJS plus supplemental information is needed where communities are already subject to adverse cumulative stressors or where a facility will create adverse cumulative stressors. The supplemental information includes detailed information on site conditions and pollution control measures. Meaningful public participation is when the applicant conducts a public hearing in the overburdened community to present the EJS. The public notice must be given 60 days prior to hearing via newspaper to property owners within 200 feet, a sign at the facility, and additional community-specific methods. There is a minimum 60-day public comment period, and applicants must respond to all public comments in writing. Upon completion of the public process, the applicant provides the EJS and any supplemental information, hearing testimony, written comments, the applicant's response to comments, and any other relevant information to the department for review and decision. The point of the EJS analysis is to consider whether a disproportionate impact is present. Disproportionate impact occurs under two scenarios. One, where a facility creates adverse cumulative stressors in an overburdened community as a result of its contribution, or two, where a facility contributes to an adverse environmental and public health stressor in an overburdened community that is already subject to adverse cumulative stressors. Again, the goal is to avoid a disproportionate impact, but where a disproportionate impact cannot be avoided, the facility will analyze and propose feasible measures to, as applicable, avoid or minimize contributions to environmental and public health stressors, provide a net environmental benefit, and where appropriate, demonstrate how a new facility serves a compelling public interest in the overburdened community. Step 3, Department Decision. The department considers the EJS and any supplemental information, testimony, written comments, the applicant's response to comments, and any other information deemed relevant by the department, and determines whether the facility can avoid a disproportionate impact. Where the facility can avoid a disproportionate impact, the department would authorize the applicant to proceed with the imposition of conditions set by the department necessary to ensure a disproportionate impact is and remains avoided. Where the facility cannot avoid a disproportionate impact, the department would, for new facilities, deny an application for a new facility unless it demonstrates it will serve a compelling public interest in the overburdened community. For expanded facilities and major source renewals, the department would authorize the applicant to proceed with department permitting subject to appropriate conditions to address facility impacts to environmental and public health stressors. Compelling public interest. Compelling public interest is an exception to the requirement that a new facility be denied where it cannot avoid disproportionate impact. Compelling public interest means the facility primarily serves an essential environmental, health, or safety need of the individuals in an overburdened community. It is necessary to serve the essential environmental health or safety need, and no other means is reasonably available to meet the established health or safety need. The focus is on public works type projects that are necessary to serve essential environmental health or safety needs of the individuals in an overburdened community, such as those which directly reduce stressors, like CSO abatement projects. Economic benefits of the proposed new facility, such as employment, tax revenue, etc., shall not be considered in determining whether it serves a compelling public interest in an overburdened community. The department considers the position of members of the overburdened community, supportive or otherwise, in determining whether a facility satisfies the compelling public interest standard. Permit conditions. Permit renewals. The goal is to avoid impacts, and where avoidance is not feasible, minimize facility contributions to individual stressors in the OBC. With permits for new and expanded facilities, Beyond avoidance and minimization, we would consider additional feasible conditions that would reduce off-site stressors or provide a net environmental benefit that improves baseline environmental and public health stressors in the overburdened community. Localized impact control technology is an objective standard for major source components based on existing air program standards. It will help address legacy sites that have lagged in technology upgrades. It focuses on technological feasibility rather than economic feasibility to drive pollution reduction through control technology.
How do we define environmental and public health stressors? To determine the final stressors considered in EJ map, the department started with a brainstorming list based on the prior department efforts, tools that provide similar data like EPA's EJ screen and California's Enviro screen, and input from varied stakeholders. The department then looked at how the stressors on the list aligned with the categories in the EJ rule, such as concentration of sources of air pollution, etc. If they were quantifiable, if quality statewide data was readily available, and if the data was meaningful at a block group scale. The department further determined if the value for including stressors adequately represented the concerns in distressed communities, since the goal was to use the minimum number of stressors necessary to accurately assess environmental and public health conditions in the OBC. This process left the department with 26 stressors. This slide details the 26 stressors in the EJ map. They include stressors in the categories of concentrated areas of air pollution, mobile sources of air pollution, contaminated sites, transfer stations and other solid waste facilities, point sources of water pollution, those stressors that may cause public health issues, density and proximity stressors, and those that fall under social determinants of health. For more detail on these stressors, view the EJ map specific training. To make the EJ permitting process consistent, objective, and accessible, the department will provide baseline information to applicants and the public. This creates common ground to start the process and essentially limits the facility's analysis to whether and how its proposed activities might impact stressor levels. EJ map is a public-facing tool available for anyone who wants to generate this information without waiting for the department. Now that we've talked about the individual stressors, we need to discuss how these stressors are used within the EJ map stressor comparisons. Essentially, each OBC or adjacent block group stressor value is compared to their geographic point of comparison, or GPC. The EJ law gave the department discretion to define the appropriate GPC, and given the varied stressors and demographics of New Jersey, we felt a hybrid approach would give citizens the most protection. Therefore, an area's GPC is the lower of the 50th percentile, or mean or middle value, of the county or state non-overburdened communities. In this way, we compared the conditions of overburdened communities with those not considered overburdened by the legislature. Each stressor is assigned a value which would be compared to the lower of county or state. The OBCs defined by the New Jersey law are based on demographics only, painting just half the picture in terms of the impacts on that community. The comparative analysis completes that picture by filling in the environmental and public health stressors that communities currently experience. The department does its stressor comparison twice. Once at the individual stressor level, comparing actual values to the individual GPCs, and then comparing the total number of stressors in that community to the CST GPC. Adjacent block groups, or ABGs, have zero population, so their individual values for stressors that depend on populations, potential lead exposure, for example, are null values. To make adverse stressor determinations, the department relies on the stressor values for the OBC that it shares its border with that has the highest CST.
Here we'll discuss how the department evaluates and creates its decision. OPPN prepares a proposed environmental justice decision for Commissioner review and approval. Under the EJ law, permits for new facilities are denied unless the applicant can show a compelling public interest. If there is a CPI, permits can be approved with EJ conditions. OPPN evaluates and reviews with programs to determine whether CPI has been shown. Permits for facility expansions or renewals of Title V air permits cannot be denied on an EJ basis, but can be approved with EJ permit conditions. Form and timing of decision. The department shall issue its decision in writing with a summary of facts, the department's analysis, and identification of any conditions set by the department that will be incorporated into subsequently issued department permits for the facility. The department's decision shall constitute a final agency decision and shall be incorporated into any related permitting decisions. Under the EJ rule, decisions cannot be issued until at least 45 days after the public hearing. Permitting clocks restart. Violation of permit conditions. A. Any violation of the conditions imposed pursuant to this chapter shall, as applicable, be considered non-minor violations or aggravating circumstances or the equivalent under any department's rules applicable to the facility. B. Any violation of the conditions imposed pursuant to this chapter shall constitute grounds for suspension or revocation in accordance with the EJ rule or the underlying permitting authorities of any department-issued permits. Here is a flowchart representing applicant timeline. Determination of applicability. Initial screen. Determination of application requirements. Preparation and review of environmental justice impact statement and supplemental information. Meaningful public participation. Department review. And finally, the department decision. Supportive documents. DEP developed and published a series of documents supporting the EJ process that are available on the OPPN website. These include frequently asked questions, meeting guidance, templates, and applications. Presented on this slide are the following DEP points of contact.
It is critically important to remember that we are charged with the responsibility of helping to make sure that all New Jerseyans can live, work, and enjoy a clean and healthy environment, that every one of us is protected equally from environmental and health hazards, that every one of us can access clean parks and outdoor recreation, and that we all have a say in and an equal ability to influence environmental decisions about our communities. These are the reasons why the environmental justice law and these regulations are so important. For too long, communities have shouldered a disproportionate share of pollution and pollution-generating facilities. Now, we have a means to improve upon that unfair legacy. This training video is a result of many months of tremendous effort by our dedicated environmental justice team. Creating the series of regulations that we call the EJ rule was something that not any one of us could have done alone. So I am particularly gratified to be part of this team and the overall DEP team, because I am certain that during the process of creating these regulations, we tapped almost every program for assistance. I am honored to have worked on this presentation and with these contributors who have also lent their voices to the narration, including Melissa Betamarco of the Office of Permitting and Project Navigation, Christine Schell of the Office of Environmental and Public Health Analysis, and Dave Pepe, the Director of OPPN. One last note. The Office of Environmental Justice, under Director Candace Perry, will provide a separate tutorial on the Environmental Justice Mapping, Assessment, and Protection Tool, EJMAP for short. This GIS tool can be used to find information to assess environmental and public health stressors in the communities where the EJ law will apply.